talk about today's meeting and what did you learn anything, or is this stuff that you already knew based on all your work before on central purchasing and fun stuff like that?
I think that when you look at it, we know there have been a lot of savings from revamping the purchasing system, but we also know that it's a massive, massive system with millions and millions and $1 billion of spend going through DCS, close to. And I think in the end, we know we always will have policy challenges to keep up and ensure that best practices are applied. And that's where the challenge comes in, and we have to always stay engaged. That's what I think this study kind of accomplished for us, is to make sure we're holding the department accountable. We're always having them tell us, how much they're saving from their reforms, but also giving those who have other ideas some input and some ability to say, hey, here's where your next generation of reforms are going. And then we as policymakers really have to make those decisions about what additional reforms make sense and what policy changes might set us back. And so that's our job, but it's really important to have these types of forums so that everyone can kind of get it out there, what they're thinking.
I can see where someone, might look at what was said at the meeting and pinpoint on the woman from OSBI pointing out that, she's paying 600% more for Blu-ray discs than she should, or 9 times what she should for a pencil. Is that a big concern for you when you see that these master contracts that we have may not necessarily be giving the lowest price available?
So it's important to separate mandatory statewide contracts on regular items where the DCS can grant an exception if there's a problem, and those are the ones we focused on, and state use, which we haven't focused on, which are still in an old legacy system that is a political hot potato to touch, because state use benefits those who are challenged and it gives them work to do and all of that. And so it's really important to draw the line between those two. I do think we need to revisit state use and take on some of that political element. It's about time that we kind of move purchasing reform into that venue a little bit. And so that's something that maybe we'll see legislation on this year. On the other issues, where there were a couple of issues pointed to on mandatory statewide, we have to look at those on each issue's base and ensure that an exception is always granted when a department finds something less expensively. And I was really pleased to hear that no one has been able to point to an instance when DCS failed to grant an exception when that was found. Now, a good case can be made that we want to reduce the paperwork in that process, and it shouldn't be that an exception is needed that often. We heard, testimony that could be as high as 15% of the time. It'd be great to knock that down to 5% of the time. But the bottom line is, when you have contracts that have 900,000 items on them, those central purchasing officials can't ensure that every single item is lower than market. But what they can do is address the exceptions as they come up and really ensure that those high volume items that are heavily used are definitely lower than the market, and we're buying in bulk. And that's where our savings is coming from.
The state's purchasing director talked about his vision of having a sort of Amazon.com web-based system that people meaning state agency purchasing directors, can go on and find the best price for something. Is there any chance of that happening in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
I'd say two. DCS has been focused on implementing their SciQuest proposal, and that product is going to be awesome. We've talked about that at the studies on higher ed, trying to allow higher ed to partner with DCS and in deploying that project, because there is a lot of upfront cost. But it's certainly a best practice, it appears, in procurement today, and it's something that I think that they'll deploy, and that'll really help those state purchasing officers when they do those comparisons to be able to simply order online through the online portal and make their job a whole lot easier. I think it's a really important reform.
Since you brought up higher education, it wasn't addressed directly in this meeting, but they are one of the agencies that's exempt from the central purchasing mandate. What are the chances of getting more agencies either under the mandate or at least using these contracts to have the sense of scale that's needed to get lower costs?
I think we can get there. I think if you heard the director talk about his Master Commodity Council, he's envisioning higher ed partnering with DCS as well as local government entities to leverage the spend and work together, cooperating without the need for legal change. The catalog is a good platform for doing that. So higher ed would have input on the negotiations with the vendors, and then subsequently would be able to order through the catalog those products without necessarily being mandated to by law. Now, I'm not opposed to looking at a mandate, but I do think that DCS is moving in the direction that they're doing it with a carrot as opposed to us doing it with a stick to try to force higher ed to buy. And I think the catalog implementation is the perfect opportunity to do that, where higher ed and procurement officers and state procurement officers can order from the same catalog. That spend will be captured so that when DCS goes to negotiate with the vendor next time, they'll know just how many items are being bought across the board. And that was a key finding of the IBM report a few years ago when they studied it. They said, we lose out on the ability to leverage spend because so much spend goes through higher ed, it doesn't go through the Central Purchasing Act. And that's where I think probably a lot of savings opportunities are if we can go there. And if we can do it by just incentivizing higher ed with the savings and also taking their input and participation as a stakeholder and then deploying the catalog so that their officers have easy access to the items, I think that's the preferable way to do it as opposed to a statutory change. Not that I'm adverse to a statutory change.
It was brought up that savings last year in various purchasing changes was $8 to $9 million, something like that. The estimate, ballpark estimate, was more this year. As you brought up, they're spending $900 million, $1 billion, so we're talking about 1% in that regard. Your desire is 5%. Do you think that 5% is going to be reached for this current fiscal year?
I think in the end they're going to have about $11–12 million of savings this year, and I think that's what we'll see on their report, which I think is in January. That'll put it at $20 million for both years. Now, percentages and all of that, I don't know. It's going to be nice to see that increase by 5% of the whole every year, or whatever the case is. We do know that the potential there is there for much greater savings because of that IBM consultants report. They estimated that we could potentially save as high as $75 million. And then if you consider the testimony from our speaker from Pennsylvania, when he talked about their annual savings is now in the 340, 360 million range. Obviously they have a lot more spend because they're a bigger state budget-wise. But we should be realizing a lot more. And that's, again, our job as policymakers to try to always keep innovative ideas coming forward and pushing towards those, millions and millions of savings every year.
The first interim study today talked about state assets and the possible, the definite inventory of those, but possible sale of those as well. And it was brought up, one thing you shouldn't do if items are sold is just put that money into general revenue, where it's essentially one-time money that would be used possibly for recurring costs. In a perfect world, where would you see any assets, sales, revenue go into?
The reforms from the purchasing side that we talked about, I think that should absolutely go to tax reduction. It's money that was being wasted through inefficient processes. We're getting rid of that waste, and so the taxpayer should realize the savings. On the asset reduction, I think the vision is that you would put that in endowment just for maintenance of existing state buildings that we need to keep. So let's get rid of those superfluous buildings and land that we don't need. Take the money that we get from the sale of those, put them in endowment so we can actually function like a business would in maintaining their capital assets, maintaining their real property, so that it doesn't depreciate to obscurity and drive you bankrupt. Here in state government, there's not incentive to do that because whenever the conditions get so bad, politicians just say, oh, we'll fix that, we'll issue bonds. Well, that's going to be paid out for years and years with unnecessary debt, interest, and fees. It's bad policy. And so what Representative Shannon is bringing to the table is to break away from the status quo, to start managing assets, to get rid of those, return them to be income-producing free market assets as much as possible. And then with our shrinking existing real property footprint, then let's actually maintain and keep it up so that we don't have deferred maintenance needs requiring bond issues in the future.